So let's get rolling. I think the best way to kind of start these conversations is just introductions for each of the projects, try to figure out what we're working on. So we can start from left to right, start with Ellie. So, and yeah, give everyone an introduction here.
Hi, I'm Ellie. I work at Espresso. You probably know what Espresso does from the previous talk. But I am a systems engineer at Espresso, as well as the lead of our consensus team. So I lead our hotshot consensus protocol. I lead all of the development for that.
Hey, Dino, one of the co-founders of Fluent, and we're building a ZK Wasm L2 on Ethereum.
Hi, I'm Grinza. I lead developer acquisition as well as product growth here at Fluent. And what we're trying to build is, we're trying to bring general purpose languages to Ethereum using our ZK Wasm execution layer that we're going to talk about in a bit. But yeah.
Hey, I'm Felipe. I'm at Cartesi. I'm a Cartesi contributor. We are doing a RISC-V modular execution layer, as well as a roll-up solution.
So I think the first thing I want to touch on, right, is because we're building these different execution environments. So from my understanding is that these also enable different programming languages, different developer tooling. Like, what's the kind of like pain point? What's the reason to build this new way of building applications on top of Ethereum? What's the reason that you guys are hearing this, and like what are the developer pain points of the EVM today specifically?
I think the way this typically works is that like you'll start off in any kind of like developer paradigm. Like you'll start off with something simple, and it's easy for somebody to just like get started, but it's usually like pretty constrained and not that flexible. And then, you know, if it gets popular, basically developers start to push the boundaries of what's possible. They want to like do more performant things, or they want to like kind of use different tooling. They basically want to end up like developing like more and more optimized kind of like applications for their use case. Whether that's for a certain, like based on a certain industry, maybe that's based on a certain like user persona, but like as an industry matures and as a developer platforms mature, they just like want to do more. And I feel like we're getting to that point, like building on Ethereum and like with the EVM environments, where developers do just want to build kind of like more highly optimized applications for these use cases. So like maybe they're trying, you know, we've gone through the rounds of DeFi and copy pasting a lot of stuff, and now people are like, all right, I want to put some games on chain. I want to put some like social stuff on chain. And so they're pushing the boundaries of like throughput, and so that's obviously where like roll-ups come in, and it's really useful. But they're also pushing the boundaries of like within the actual VM and execution environment itself of like new types of flexibility or performance. And that's where like Rust starts to become useful, C++ starts to become useful. Things that like developers are already used, like ways that developers are already used to building. Like you don't have to convince a developer that Rust or C++ gives that, like lets them do more within a certain execution environment. It's like they already know this. And so I think like I'm losing track of the original question, but like the way at least we see it is like there's a lot of hunger for developers to kind of like break through the boundaries of like what's easily accessible and possible on Ethereum today.
Grinza, do you have anything to add to that?
I feel like I can go on and on about this and why exactly we should like move away from EVM, but I can give you some pointers, right? Like in terms of developer experience, in terms of like just projects building on top of EVM, and like what are the things which they feel like is lacking on EVM, right? I would say EVM has worked really well for a lot of use cases, but now we, like in this industry at this point in time, we need use cases which conveys more interactive experiences, right? And I mean, with all these experiences, the kind of things that we are expecting out of an app, right? It has to be, it comes with like a lot of complexities within the smart contracts, right? But by design, EVM is usually opinionated, which was like, I mean, they created their EVM design based on the ethos of Bitcoin itself, right? It has worked really well for like a lot of use cases again. But the problem is that when you look at their design, they have this depth of like 1024 items, and each item can only have, I think, 256 kind of bit words, right? And this limit, basically, what happens with this limit is that you can only do too much of complexities, or you can only support too much of complexity within the smart contract. So that also means that we're going to end up hitting that limit. Okay, like this is it. Like we have reached the point where these are the use cases that could only be built on EVM, right? What about having Netflix? What about having Figma on chain, right? And all these experiences need a solution which can support them computationally, and that's where like WASM comes in, that's where like Cartesi comes in, right? So that's just one part. The other part is the security layer as well, right? So when we talk about EVM, there is tag-based solution, right? And then with WASM, with EVM, it has like a lot of loopholes in terms of smart contracts, in terms of Solidity as a language as well, right? But with WASM, what ends up happening is that WASM by default is a sandboxed environment, right? So even if someone is trying to hack a part of your network, I think that part is basically isolated from the rest of the network. So you're secure by default, right? And then the performance penalty comes with like the design choice that they had with like 256-bit code, like the words that they support, right? So there's a lot of things that goes into it, but I would say in terms of developer experience, the languages that they support, the tooling that they have right now, it's very limited. Again, like highly and usually opinionated design, and it can only solve a lot more problems, but then we're gonna hit like a peak point very soon.
Yeah, so Felipe, with the Cartesi VM specifically, it's Linux-based, but it supports a number of programming languages. So like, what's the thesis here? Like, how do you onboard developers, and what's the kind of like the tooling that you're putting in place with Cartesi?
Yeah, sure. So I really do believe that execution environments are very context dependent. So there's no silver bullet, right? So you have to choose the execution layer that fits what you're trying to build and what kind of apps you're trying to support. So at Cartesi, our main thing is allowing developer tooling. So we're trying to bridge the gap between Web3 applications and the open source libraries and tooling that was built for Web2. And even more important than the applications that were built or the code that was already written is the code that will come, right? So it's not like we're here on Web3 writing our applications, but while we're doing that, there's a whole industry of millions of Web2 developers who are contributing and building these next generation of libraries and so on. And with the current execution environments that we have for Web3, this is not available to us. So that's why at Cartesi we chose this RISC-V virtual machine, which puts a Linux operating system, which then allows us to actually connect to the open source tooling that we have out there. Our thesis.
Okay, that makes tons of sense. So I guess what I'm hearing is that there are certain limitations to developing on the EVM, so we're building these alternative execution environments that have different trade-offs, but they also can supply more Web 2 like developer tooling to help onboard developers into the space. So I guess a concern with that is that can obviously, you're building different VMs and that can fragment liquidity. You know, solutions obviously like Espresso are, to my VM agnostic. So when you're designing infrastructure and you're trying to onboard all of these different roll-up applications, what's the process of making the infra behind it VM agnostic and able to interact with any of these types of execution environments?
So like you said, we want to be VM agnostic because of all of the reasons that were just said. So when we design our infrastructure, I think there's a few different components. So, the first time we usually will do an iteration with a specific VM because it's easy to show that something is working and it's easy to prototype. But from there, we'll back up and we'll say, okay, like what are the core APIs? What are the core requirements of that any VM might have? And so we make a really general design. And then we also do research. So for example, we'll talk to other VM projects. We'll do our research to say, are there VMs out there that need extra features that, our prototype VM did not? So from there, we'll basically build this very general design that can support any virtual machine. And then the final part of that is that we have a test net. And so we get different VMs to deploy on our test net. And then inevitably, we find things that maybe don't work so well. And we fix them. So I guess the whole process is just a very iterative process of like doing an MVP, doing research, generalizing it, and then testing it, and repeating that over and over.
Awesome. So so there's a lot of infrastructure providers, right? Like I feel like 2023 was like the year of other like modular data availability layers and sequencers. It feels like shared prover networks are going to be a big theme in 2024. When you guys are designing these roll-up stacks with different trade-offs, how do you think about onboarding or selecting the infrastructure partners that you're going to work with? Like, what's the decision, like do you enshrine a specific sequencer, a DA layer? Do you provide the roll-ups or applications that are building your stack with multiple choices? Like how do you guys kind of feel about that selection process?
So we actually think about that a lot at Cartesi, because we like to think of, we call it the cone of innovation. So it's a little bit of a description between the interplay of data and computation, right? Because if you think about it, if you have infinite data but a very limited execution environment and very limited processing power, there's not much you can do with that data, right? Like you have infinite data, but you have let's say a pocket calculator to get through that data. And the same thing on the opposite direction. You can have infinite processing power, but not enough data, and then what will you use that processing power on, right? So at Cartesi, we're focusing a lot on complex applications and high processing power. So we definitely need to connect with good data availability solutions and sequencers for feeds and so on. So I like to think of these different stacks of solutions as an experiment in expanding the design space of possible use cases. Because with Ethereum, you can do a lot. With Ethereum plus layer 2s and app chains, you can do even more. And as soon as you start adding these other like capabilities to the stack, then you can start actually increasing the amount of verticals that you can actually provide, the things that we want to provide, like censorship resistance and all the like why we're building Web3, right? So the goal, I guess, is to find the architectures to provide these core features of Web3 to as many applications as possible. So.
Yeah, do you have anything to add to that, Dina?
Not too much. I mean, I think it just like as a product builder, like I think it really depends on like what types of use cases you're trying, like what the applications or the types of like customers or use cases you're really trying to serve, and that should really shape like the rest of your design decisions. Like if you're trying to be something that's very DeFi centric, for example, like maybe you would need to choose like that much more of a decentralized like sequencer network, or maybe if you needed to do something that was like just pure, like a very app specific, pure verifiable compute, and maybe you just needed to run this thing on a damn supercomputer, maybe you would do something more centralized because it doesn't matter. Maybe there's no MEV. It's fine. I don't know. Like I think the design decisions like very greatly depend on like what you're trying to serve. If you want just like more general high throughput stuff, you might opt for like an AltDA and do a Validium versus like an Ethereum rollup might be better suitable for other types of use cases. So, I mean, the way like we certainly think about it at Fluent is we want to enable some of these kind of like the apps kind of like on the horizon around gaming and consumer and social stuff. So like that's why we opted for using kind of EigenDA for like our DA solution as an example. And we also end up wanting to see, like we think that there's a big opportunity to kind of create like an ecosystem across these different like, I'll say like execution environments, whether they're technically blockchains or whether they're just like verifiable compute environments, built using our framework called Fluent Base. And we do see an opportunity for those to be like very interoperable. So like we, for example, want to integrate with an Espresso to make sure that all of those, let's just call them L3s for now, no matter like lack of a better specific term, let's just say all the L3s, we want them to be able to like very seamlessly compose together. So because that's part of our design decision, like we will integrate with something like an Espresso. But ultimately it just depends what you're trying to build.
No, that makes a ton of sense. And like to build on that, like integrating with Espresso, I think there's kind of this conception in the space that if you integrate with a shared sequencer protocol, you're integrating with, like, there's only one protocol to integrate with. But with an Espresso specifically, you can also modularize it. So you can use it specifically as a data availability solution. You can use it for sequencing. Kind of, how do you think about like the different types of roll-up choices that like the roll-ups can make, and like why would they integrate specifically with one aspect of the stack versus like the entire sequencer protocol?
Yeah, so we definitely try to allow for a lot of customization and modularity in our sequencer design. And so, I mean, just like Dina was saying, it depends on what the app is doing. So, for example, one of the things that we do is we have this very unique mechanism for electing different proposers for different rollups. But you can also have a proposer that will propose for multiple rollups at once, and that's how we can get really good, cross-chain interoperability. But anyway, when we're designing for these things, so like our DA layer, we try to think about the strengths of the Espresso system. So one of the strengths of the Espresso system is like we have very high throughput, and that we also have very fast finality. So like our DA layer is designed with that in mind. It has very high throughput and very fast finality, which you might say like, oh, of course, every protocol wants to have high throughput and fast finality, but there's actually trade-offs that you need to make there. I was going to say one other thing, and come back to me in a second. Yeah.
Sounds good. So, Krinza, I do want to ask, like, because developers can make these different trade-offs, like, what are some of the applications that you're expecting to get built on Fluent? Like, what are some of the ideas that you're seeing? I know there's a private test net. Like, what are people really excited about? What's kind of the feedback you're getting there, and what are you expecting?
I feel like my first answer would be just on-chain games, and I think it's like this word has been like commercialized a lot. It has like lost meaning. But I want to pinpoint how games work, like how people are building developer experiences using like mud solutions or all these gaming frameworks. And it's interesting because when you look at the gaming landscape, there's a lot of things that goes into like gaming, right? So there's wallet, there's inbuilt assets, there's NFTs, there's the game physics that's basically on-chain or off-chain, right? And then there's a lot of assets that's basically around supporting different logics and different aspects of the game itself, right? So all these interactions within the game, it requires certain logics to happen or being written in terms of code, right? And so what we have figured, I spend a lot of time just talking to game developers, and we have done that for the longest time, right? And we figured that all these developers have to go back and rebuild the entire stuff just because the tooling was not available for the blockchain specific context, right? But if the same guys or the teams wanted to build the exact same thing in Web 2, they had like the influx of developer tooling available for them in Web 2 space, right? So like that's something that we have to fix. So like developer tooling is something that I would personally like just go, like I would say like we would double down on developer tooling first, and then we're gonna see what kind of use cases it can bring on the table as well, right? It's a two-way street. We have to think in terms of proposition or the value that we can provide to each other, rather than okay, we have built the infrastructure, you guys figure out what to build, right? This is not how things work. But in terms of use cases, I would say AI and ML, this integration of AI with crypto, this is going to be huge because verifiable compute is something which has been required, because I come from an AI data science background, and I was like, this is such a cool thing. Like if you can verify models, you can verify data, you can verify accuracy of that, like it's a cool thing. So I'm excited about like a lot of things, but yeah, I think interactive experiences in general, I want to see Figma or these kind of design tools which requires a lot of computation behind the scene to be built on top of like Web3 in general.
Awesome. I appreciate it. And with Cartesi, you guys have, I think the website's called Rollup Lab, if I'm not mistaken. So like, what are you guys seeing people build on top of Cartesi and the different types of applications, and how do you kind of see that trend going in the future? You said it focusing on high complexity. I just want to learn a little bit more about the specific apps.
Yeah, that's a good question. We're actually seeing a very wide range of different types of applications, which is quite interesting. We do have a lot of people interested in games. There's actually right over there's a Rives, which is a game arcade built on Cartesi. But we've seen applications on AI as well. We have like someone running an LLM on-chain in a deterministic way. We have experiments in governance. It's kind of like beautiful what you can see when you actually allow developers to focus on what they're building rather than having them them deal with the limitations of where they're building in, right? So if you have developers building in the EVM, and like just a disclaimer, I love the EVM. I'm not an EVM hater. I think it's useful for a lot of things. But when you're building on EVM, you're forced to deal with all these design trade-offs. You have to rebuild the wheel, and not only rebuild the wheel, but you also have to optimize for very specific things that of a mental model that is of shared applications, right? So it's a very different mental model. It's a very different way of building applications. So building there is a big effort and very complicated, right? So once you give them the tooling that we're trying to give them, then they can actually focus on building what they want to build. And that creates these like awesome use cases and these very exciting projects that we're seeing.
Okay, so again, it's kind of like what I'm hearing from both sides here is that we have these theses and we have the way that we think the teams are going to be deploying on our specific roll-up stack, but ultimately we just need to provide the developer tooling and experience to kind of bring them on. For people sitting in the audience, who is thinking about deploying an application on a roll-up or building a roll-up specifically? Is anyone currently working through that right now? Okay. Yeah, we have a couple. Would you specifically want to deploy on the EVM, or are you looking at other alternative virtual machines? Alternative, right? It's okay. So the feedback loop is kind of like, this is like the modular thesis, right? We want more opportunities. Like, I guess like that's one thing Fluent, you guys have been leading into from, I would say just like a comms perspective, is like the modular thesis. Can you talk a little bit more about, like, because from someone on the outside looking in, kind of coming into the space as a developer the first time, it's kind of like this narrative, but like, what does it mean at its core, and like, what is the message that you're trying to get across with that specific vision?
To me, modularity means like specialization and developer choice. Like I think at the end of the day, when you have like a bunch of these like experiments and teams kind of building things in parallel, and it does make like a more intense kind of competitive environment, but ultimately that ends up being much better for the user, whether that's an end user or a developer or whatever. And so I think, yeah, I guess like modularity to me means kind of like focusing on what you are uniquely suited for, what you're like the absolute best at, and kind of like not having to worry about the rest. And I do think that that ends up just being kind of like net better experiences overall. And I think where the modular blockchain thesis kind of blends with this like AltVM thesis is like when you're able to separate kind of the consensus stuff from like the execution stuff, you know, you can end up getting much more, like you can start like it's way easier to experiment with a bunch of different execution environments in parallel. Like, because the hard thing to really bootstrap is the consensus part. And so when you're able to just like unify the consensus and security across all of these different experiments, you can just, all of those experiments can just like move much faster without having the prerequisite of starting a revolution at the social layer. And so when you're able to kind of like bootstrap on top of an Ethereum, you can have 1,000 Cartesi rollups and 1,000 Fluent rollups, all just trying to provide the best damn experience possible, doing all sorts of trade-offs. And like, some of them are gonna win, some of them are not. It's not gonna, I don't think any of this is gonna be a winner-take-all kind of dynamic. But there's obviously going to be, even within just like Fluent rollups, there's going to be some winners, some losers. Some of the trade-offs are going to be better for more applications than others. And it seems like a no-brainer that ends up being like a very good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Felipe.
Just adding, I guess, a single phrase. I think it's a huge shame to explore modular architectures and app chains without exploring the massive design space of execution environments, right?
So, what is like, I guess we can kick it over to the Q&A session after this question, but like what's your modular prediction for like 2024 and even going into 2025? Like what do you see taking, like kind of playing out in like the next 18 months? I do want to hear from everybody, so I want to start with Ellie first, and we can just like the introductions, go left to right.
Yeah, so I think that the modular thesis will play out with a lot of, having us having a lot more niche roll-ups that can specialize in things. One of the most interesting parts about it, though, is that I think roll-ups being able to specify their ordering policies and their MEV policies on a per rollup basis. So MEV extraction is a very controversial topic, and I think that this is very important because different rollups will want to have different MEV policies. For some rollups that have a lot of DeFi, it might make sense for them to have a first come, first serve ordering policy. For other rollups that are using encrypted transactions, maybe it's really not that big of a deal. So I just think that this is really important, and I think it'll be really interesting to, one, see the new ordering policies that different rollups can come out with, and then two, just to also see how this, maybe gives users a lot better user experience based on the rollup that they're using. For example, a gaming rollup that does not have a lot of MEV, it might not make a lot of sense to order it in the same way that a DeFi rollup does. So this is where I think it'll be really interesting to see.
I think that things are going to get a lot more messy in the short term. Like, I think the fragmentation, all right, so maybe I think the fragmentation is going to get much worse in the short term, but ultimately the experience will be orders of magnitude better than monolithic environments. So what I mean by that is, like, I feel like we're just scratching the surface of experimentation at like VMs and L2s. And that some of that has to do with the actual like execution environments themselves, whether it be programming languages or precompiles and stuff like that. But I also think we're going to see a lot more around like economic experimentation, governance experimentation, all types of stuff, and it will be messy in the short term. It just will. But then ultimately, I think that the user experience for any given dev and any given user in the medium to longer term will be so much cleaner than if we didn't do that experimentation, because we will get to the point where there's some more consolidation across the best ideas. And at that point, any given dev will be able to just kind of like actually focus on just the thing that they do best and plug it into kind of this existing ecosystem that does better interoperate, and there's more standards and stuff like that across the board. So yeah, maybe like messy in the short term and just very beautiful in the longer term.
I feel like in next few years, modularity is going to be like the default setting for a lot of use cases, for a lot of infrastructure, like how infra works, the design choices and all of different things. But particularly how I see modularity works like in terms of like the WASM context, or like what we are building at Fluent, I see two things. So we are initially like basically trying to optimize for, again, like two things. First is the developer choice, right? And the other thing is giving access of Ethereum to like literally everyone, right? And it can only be achieved by collaborations and collaborating with like different EVM or non-EVM networks or different ecosystems or blockchains or languages and all of these different toolings that's available, right? And I feel like modularity in some sort provides you with this flexibility where if I'm talking about in terms of developer choice, the pro side of modularity or modular blockchain is that I can enable a lot of DA solutions within my network and let developers or projects choose like what works for them best, right? We might have like a default setting for, let's say we are going for like eigenlayer or something, right? But we're going to end up giving you options as well. Okay, you can integrate with Avail, you can integrate with like these many solutions as well, right? So it's interesting to look at in that frame of context, right? And in terms of having access to Ethereum and making it easier for a lot of different ecosystems, I feel like if we open up this stage and provide like a soft ground of collaborations with different teams, just like by outsourcing certain part of this stack off of your network, it's gonna create like much more innovative solutions within your ecosystem.
So I have two main predictions. The first one is that you're going to see a lot of new layers being born. So like the aggregator layer, the governance layer, the liquidity layer, convenience layer. And the second prediction ties into that, which is that it's going to be a beautiful mess. And for a while, it's going to be very hard to understand the trust assumptions, the security assumptions. The developers are going to get very confused. And then I hope we'll start to focus on better abstractions and convenience and a way to tie all of that in a manner that the developers can actually focus on what they're building and feel safer, I guess, in choosing a stack without having to deeply research each protocol and the interoperability between each protocol. So first, many more layers, a Cambrian explosion of possibilities, and second, better information and abstractions on how to deal with those possibilities, right?
One quick example, just a way to think about it, is in the near term, you might have, right, you're picturing all this experimentation across a bunch of different layer twos and all these different trust assumptions, and it's going to be like hard to parse, like honestly, in the near term. But then what happens is then you get the equivalent, one day you get the equivalent of like the SSL lock or something like that, right? Where you do kind of have a standard. Maybe like it starts with kind of like the very nuanced space of like L2 beat and everything that they're doing, but eventually there's just kind of a social consensus comes to like, okay, these are kind of like the core like checkboxes that matter. And once you cross over those like 10 checkboxes, you get the lock, like kind of the equivalent of the SSL lock. And then everything becomes much easier because all you have to think about is that lock. Kind of thing. So that's the thing. Like I think, but to get to that point where you know what those 5 or 6 checkboxes should be, you have to go through the messy experimentation phase. And so that's kind of like I think just like a way to at least concretize what I think you were trying to say.
And a big shout out to L2 Bits. They are doing a great job trying to figure out the security assumptions and the trust assumptions of all these L2 solutions. So we need more of that, and we'll need even more of that in the future. But that's a very good example.
Like layers on top of L2 beat, right? Like L2 beat is like the core data part of it, and then you kind of need even abstractions and mental models on top of that, which will be built over time, and that's when things get a lot easier.
It's funny that you say that because Justin Drake wrote this in a recent Ethereum Foundation AMA. It's like Ethereum is like a teenager right now, and it's like growing up, and it's going through like, you know, when you're a teenager, it sucks. Like life is just horrible. Your mind's changing.
Pimples and shit.
Yeah, it's awful, right? So it's like Ethereum's very weirdly like in that stage, and it has to go through those growing pains before it can get to that end state where it's like the checkbox, and you just deploy the application, and it interoperates with hundreds and thousands of others. So it's awesome to kind of hear like that kind of like aligns with like the general thesis there. I understand that there is a bit of background noise, but I want to give the audience Q&A a shot here. Does anyone have any specific questions on stage right now? I can bring the mic to you. Okay, I got one in the back. Cool. I'm going to get over there.
Hey, thanks for the talk, y'all. So I wanted to ask, a lot of layer 2s are positioning themselves as platforms to spin up layer 3 for app-specific projects. When we're talking AltVMs, do you think there's one choice that's better than others in terms of, do we want a general purpose VM like Wasm? Do we want an Alt-L1 VM like Solana? Or do we want something custom built like a Cairo Fuel type of thing?
So I believe there's no silver bullet. I tend to divide AltVMs into AltVMs that are optimized for having shared applications, so applications sharing the same execution layer. Just because the mental model there is very specific, you have things like adversarial gas metering, and you have applications that can attack each other. It's a very different mental model. And VMs which are optimized for app chains, or this idea of like a single application living on each chain. But even if you make that division, you still have very different requirements based on each application, right? So you have applications that need high computational intensity, and they're going to choose one VM. You have applications that need privacy, maybe privacy on inputs, or privacy on the execution aspect of it, privacy on the state. So there's just a list of requirements that you can go through with many different trade-offs, which can guide your choice into what execution layer you're going to choose, right? So I don't think there's a silver bullet to summarize it.
I don't think there's one model that's better than the other. I think we're going to see both. I think we're going to see kind of like the more vertical like L2s and then a bunch of L3s on top, and then we're also going to see kind of networks with just like a bunch of L2s that are all like aggregating proofs or something like that. So I really do think it'll be all over the place. I think I think in some scenarios it's going to make, like I think there's going to end up being like a clear fit for some types of applications where the L3 thing will make more sense just because it's just like less friction to do, and it's like all, they want it to be more tightly integrated and stuff like that. Maybe it's some like, I don't know, maybe some kind of like within an application, maybe like certain types of actions within an application that are like really small tasks are just like these ephemeral little L3 things. I don't know. And then maybe kind of like other ecosystems where kind of like the more horizontal L2 thing makes more sense and everything's aggregated. I don't know. I honestly don't, it's very not clear.
I would even dare to say that some applications might make sense on L1. Which might be controversial. But
I don't think everything will move away from L1. I think things will stay on L1 for a long time.
Yeah.
Like I think that there's some type of comfort in it just being like a smart contract on Ethereum, just using like something with, you know, like a Uniswap on Ethereum. If you can afford it, man, like you're a nation state in 10 years from now, you can probably afford it. Like it's probably fine. And you're just like, there's like the heebie-jeebies of like using anything on an L2. You're just not going to do it.
Yeah, 100% aligned there.
That's so funny actually, because we were having this conversation like this morning, like in general as well, and we were like, we don't see a difference of like, I feel like Solana and Near protocols and all these networks who are experimenting with non-EVM like VM structures, I feel like we're kind of in the same space. Like it's different in terms of like, oh, they are L1s versus we are L2s and we are focused on the execution layer, but in a bigger landscape, we are just all doing the exact same thing, right?
Awesome. Any other questions from the audience? Cool. Awesome. Do speakers, any closing thoughts before we head to the happy hour for the evening?
Honestly, just that I'm really excited to see what AltVMs and like, especially their use with a shared sequencer like Espresso. I'm really excited to see all of the neat things that can come out of it. I think we're going to see a lot of projects that we haven't even thought of yet. I think it's very exciting. It's like a very exciting space.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I really do think we're just scratching the surface on like all the different configurations of these rollups. Like I think we're just going to see this period of like pretty insane experimentation, and I'm excited for it. Like I think we will get to the point where like you're able to put things on chain. I think we're going to get past the threshold of accessibility and kind of like ease of use, and also just like interest in putting things on chain, where it'll start to be, block space will start to be treated a little bit more like bandwidth did in like the early 2000s, where like people are just going to fill that thing as much as they can, and they're just going to dump as much stuff. Right now there's like enough of allergic reaction for blockchain, and the interest hasn't gone mainstream. So I feel like we're not at that point, and the tooling's still getting there and whatnot. But I really do think that'll flip at some point, and people will want to just like, it's going to just be so convenient to just dump things on chain. And at that point, everything will get filled up. Bullish.
I would say like if this conversation piqued any curiosity for you guys to like have an interest in deploying stuff on like AltVM or like VMs, which is not basically EVM, like feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to give you access. We are currently in a private testnet phase, and we are working with like a lot of launch partners. I would love to onboard like developers who are open to experiment stuff. Like we can jam on ideas, we can like build something together, and it's really like I would love to like take a feedback. Feel free to roast our network. Like that's what I want. That's what I optimize for. Like we want developer feedback so that we can improve, right? So like just reach out. We have our Twitter handles up here. You can also tweet at us at like Fluent XYZ, right? So yeah, I guess reach out.
Yeah, I don't want to be in between people on their happy hour, so I'll go with embrace experimentation, build responsibly, let's cooperate and play long coordination games, and let's
Awesome.
drink something and chat more.
Awesome, appreciate it, guys. Yeah, and you can follow Cartesi Project at Cartesi Project, Fluent at Fluent XYZ, and Espresso at EspressoSys. Guys, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.